cases when the evidence of the effect is too overwhelming, or when the anticipated effect is too small to be detected even when the full data is collected. Such interim analysis and early stops are possible while controlling the type 1 error rate, alpha. Suppose we wish to control the overall alpha to a 0.05, which very common, at least in HCI. So each interim analysis needs to be tested with a more strict criteria. In this chart, the horizontal axis shows the 3 interims analysis at 50, 75, and 100% of the target sample size. And the vertical axis shows the nominal alpha, which is the stricter criteria at each interim analysis. In this example, the first analysis is tested with the nominal alpha of 0.011, and the second is tested against 0.017, and then the final analysis tested against 0.022. These predefined interim analysis and nominal alpha makes group sequential designs legit, and group sequential designs are not p-hacking. Researchers can choose the spending function from many available choices. Although each spending function controls the type 1 error rate, they distribute nominal alphas to the interim analysis differently. So here are 2 examples of a particular spending function called exponential spending function. You can see the red spending function is more conservative at the first interims analysis, which you can see by a relatively low nominal alpha. It gradually relaxes in subsequent analysis. However, the blue spending function is more aggressive with a high nominal alpha at the first interims analysis, but it sharply reduces the nominal alpha in the next interim analysis. When the nominal alpha is high in the beginning, there's a greater probability to find significant results at the earlier interims analysis. However, high probability is balanced by stricter criteria in subsequent analysis. I wish to highlight that both choices of spending functions are statistically sound, and therefore when selecting a spending function, researchers can allocate the risk to each point in their data collection. My work focuses on facilitating researchers to designing these group sequential designs. Specifically, I would like to make it easier for researchers to explore choices on when to conduct interim analysis and which spending function to use. Statistical software packages such as GSDesign or GroupSeq provide a computational basis for group sequential designs in R, whereas, for example, Vazire and Mackell recently developed RPack that actually provides a GUI interface. However, we would like to further facilitate the exploration of possible choices and help researchers comparing the consequences of their choices. I'd like to show the software that we're developing, so let me walk you through a scenario of planning the experiment. Let's assume that we want to design a within subjects experiment where we need a multiple of 5 participants due to counterbalancing. According to an a priori power analysis, based on a reliable effect size of a Cohen's d of 0.03 from the literature, we need to recruit a maximum of 90 participants. Suppose we want to conduct 2 interim analyses and 1 final analysis. We decide to conduct the interims analysis at 70 participants and 1 interim analysis at 50 participants, indicated here by the vertical green lines. Now we can explore the spending functions at the bottom. To begin, we set ourselves to a somewhat risk neutral, and we can see that both of the spending functions that we compare here are relatively flat. Suppose we are more conservative and move the slider to the right. We can now observe how the spending functions increase the nominal alpha towards the end.
Alexander, just one more sentence if you can.
All right, and yes, we are still working on the software. As you can see, if you have used group sequential design, we could use your input. If you're interested in group sequential design, please help us evaluate it. Drop me an email. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alexander. Again, we're out of time, so we'll move on to the next speaker. But if you have questions for Alexander, I'm sure he'll pay attention to the chat. And I apologize, Alexander, and especially Cooper. I forgot to record the session at the beginning, so we didn't record your talk, Cooper, at the beginning of your talk, Alexander. I'm very sorry about that. That was my mistake. Our next speaker is Jeremy. And once again, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. If there's time, we'll get to them within the 6 minutes. If not, perhaps at the end.
Okay, great, thank you. I'd like to talk about some work I did in tests of robustness. So any reproducibility talk must include this grid, which is Kirsty Whitaker's matrix of reproducibility. We're working in the lower left quadrant. So I did want to see if bioinformatic analyses could be evaluated in terms of robustness by allowing reviewers to swap out analyses on existing papers. So this follows actually a long history of various types of case studies, which I collect in my GitHub awesome reproducible research repository, which I encourage you to look at. As you see, tests of robustness are seldomly executed. Normally, they're done as a type of tool-centric self-evaluation, but they're growing in popularity. In bioinformatics, there's a number of tools that essentially do the same thing, that come from competing labs and are derived from different models. And that's okay, that's a strength, because I mean, some of them follow a more biologically disciplined origin, others are derived from machine learning, and others are simply empirically derived. But here's an example where various aligners and variant colors are swapped, and as you can see, there's although there's a central number of genes that are differentially expressed between all these combinations, there's a lot of different views as to the underlying biology. So in order to assess the validity of various bioinformatic papers, I use 3 different methods. And the method I want to discuss today is a workflow library derived method, but I also engaged in faithful reproductions, where I tried to make a very exact reproduction of an existing paper and allowed people to make tweaks to that paper and see if they derived the same results. And an advisor-led approach in which I consulted experts and then engaged in these manipulations myself. In the faithful reproduction approach, I felt like people were reluctant to start manipulating workflows deeply or aggressively just because they had a working pipeline that they didn't want to break. And the advisor-led approach was, very dependent on communication between experts, and that certainly turned into a bottleneck. I think the workflow library approach is interesting because it derives on strengths from community-led efforts into bioinformatic pipelines, which unlike some of the social sciences or data sciences, a lot of the work done in bioinformatics is done in pipelines, which are essentially pre-processing steps that either follow serial or parallel steps. NF Core is a community-led group that develops workflow libraries based on the Nextflow pipeline framework. And these are essentially curated, and there are certain guidelines and standards in order to become an NF Core pipeline. So I want to leverage the enthusiasm for these pipelines in order to look at a paper that I felt like could use a test of robustness. So in order to identify a paper, I use the Cite AI service, which looks at disputing citations. And this paper, called Topology of the Human M6A RNA methylomes, popped up. It also has a number of pub-peer comments. So it's, although a highly cited paper, there's a number of disputing citations on this paper. And I felt like I could use this to examine if there was in silico reasons behind that. So I had three reviewers who all engaged in these tests of robustness using either RNA-seq or M6A type workflows. And they discovered some major discrepancies in terms of the reported number of differentially expressed genes. They found when they swapped out for similar papers done in mice, they found that there was almost no overlap in the exact differentially expressed genes between this and other similarly M6A centric papers. And then in terms of the actual peak profiles that were found, we're looking into that, but I find that there's a lot of disputing data about the M6A peak profiles that were done in this initial paper, just because it was essentially a landmark paper that did not maybe have a good grounding in the both the wet lab and in silico steps that were required.
Jeremy, one more sentence to wrap up, please. Sorry.
So yeah, there was a few more bottlenecks to this, but I feel like we have a good grip on moving forward with this approach in bioinformatics.
Great, thank you very much. And that brings us to our last speaker. Austin, over to you.
Hi. Okay. Before I share my screen, I'm going to use a little prop. This is a floss bridge toothpick. I had been told every day of my life that I needed to floss more often and never got to the point where I was doing it more than once a week, right? Then I discovered these things. Now I do it every day religiously. And what goes for dental hygiene also goes for information hygiene. So it's great to be on a panel with a bunch of other people who are building something, because it's great to have these little tools that can make a big difference to our behavior. And that's what I'm about as well. And we'll get there in just a second. Now, oh, sorry, the Zoom thing is covering me up. There we go. I'm from a company. I'm not an academic. I'm a startup douchebag. My company is called Stone. We built something called the Stone Research Transparency System. We believe that research is valuable and we want to make it visible, and we mean that literally, and we'll get to that. But I'm going to race through the big picture. My talk is called Ending Epistemological Thatcherism. Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. We are all individuals. She was talking about economics, but you can imagine that applied to epistemology too. And that raises the question, is knowledge a purely individual and private affair, or is there such a thing as public knowledge? If there was such a thing as public knowledge, in what would it consist? So the Phil 101 definition of knowledge is, at the individual level, a justified true belief. So a public or collective knowledge would be a justified true consensus. Was there ever such a thing as a justified true consensus? Because we have this nostalgia for the days before the internet, before fake news apparently, and I don't think there was. There was what we would call synthetic consensus in the 20th century. And here I'm channeling Noam Chomsky in the idea of manufacturing consent. Put very briefly, that means you have a vibrant debate within particular boundaries defined by major media institutions. Other voices are marginalized, excluded, and ignored rather than violently oppressed. So you have this as your full political spectrum, and you kind of mute out the edges to get a more controlled conversation. And what that means is that within that those boundaries, you can have a consensus, and that acts as if it's a real consensus across the population. So that might be something that we want to remain controversial, like American foreign policy is guided by benevolent intentions, or it might be something like vaccines are safe and effective, which we don't want to be controversial. We're now in a brave new world where there's no gatekeepers or filters. Democracy is empirically in retreat since 2013, so information chaos seems to have advantages for despots too. Synthetic discord is the new tactic of regressive forces. You keep the debate going on forever while you build your settlements or you sell your coal or whatever it is you want to do. And then there's a terrifying final step where these bad faith arguments become a genuine belief system wildly at odds with reality. So is an organic consensus possible? I believe yes, but it has to be methodological rather than institutional credibility, which drives that consensus. So less Fordism, less big information factories like newsrooms, and more Taylorism. Intellectual Taylorism, where the tactics and ergonomics of knowledge production are examined. What does that look like? It looks like this, which is Scott's article. I've actually already got it open. This is a journalist who's using the tool my team has built. So they've got this story about, they've identified the source of some money that was going to the RNC and Trump as a decorated Russian naval officer, and they've captured their research. So you can see there were 278 minutes of research that went into this story. This was on 4 different occasions, 4 research events, we call them. And he's added 13 highlights, which are times at which he's turned on his webcam and commented on the document or whatever it is that he's looking at. So we'll just skip ahead a couple of times here. You can see there he was looking at Twitter. Now he's looking at this, whatever this source document is that he's using to identify this person. And if you click through, you can either follow him on Twitter, 1 second, or you can see the full research process, which is not just the highlights, but everything that's captured. So for example, this second research event has no highlights. It's just an hour or so of research. So that's our system, and that's our way of, as I say, ending epistemological Thatcherism. We see ourselves as where social media might be in front of or on top of the news deliverable, we are behind and underneath, providing a epistemological audit trail, we call it. Final point, this quote, "There's no such thing as society, we're all individuals." I'm not certain it's accurate. In fact, I have reason to believe it is not. And I hope you'll join me for the workshop later this evening, where we're going to investigate this quote together. I have deliberately not found out. So if you're going to come, don't look it up until we're in the workshop together. And then we're going to all look for it separately and then compare the different techniques we used to try and identify whether or not this is a real quote. So that's tonight, 7:30, and as part of the Amos lineup.
Great, thank you so much, Austin. We have time for a quick question if anyone has one.
It's PC only, I'm afraid. For now.
Okay, I don't see any in the chat. Sorry. So I think that's it.
Just put the website in as well.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to stop recording and we are going to transition to the next session.